Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel Beth Chats Books. Now today I'm finally going to do my July wrap up. So I had quite a successful July. I managed to read 7 books and some of them were poetry collections and bits and bats. So it was quite successful. Halfway through the month I didn't think I would achieve the number I ended up achieving, but I had some last minute quick reads that I got through to make up my numbers at the end of the month. So, some of them I have returned or they were an audiobook, so I'll just have to insert a picture for them, but I'll just get straight stuck in with this video. So the first book I read in the month of July was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire by J.K. Rowling. As everybody knows, I'm rereading this series, so obviously I've got to book 4 this month. This is one of my favourite Harry Potter stories. I really like the Triwizard Tournament, all the events that go on in that, and we start to get more of the kind of character development of all the individual characters. You know exactly what this book is. If you're not a Harry Potter fan and you don't know, then go and read them. And I'm really excited to read Order of the Phoenix next month. And I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars because it is one of my favourite Harry Potter stories, but I won't dwell on it too much because most of you know the plot, you know all the juicy bits, you know the Triwizard Tournament and when we find out Voldemort's back, so there we are. And then the next book I read in the month of July is In Her Shambles by Elizabeth Parker. So I have done a review of the 2 poetry collections that I read that month that were sent to me by Serin Books. I apologise, I mispronounced the name of the company when I did my Spotlight video, and I want to sincerely apologise for that, but it is not Serene Books, it's Serin Books. But these were beautiful collections. I will link down below the video where I mention these in a little bit more detail. But suffice to say, I really did enjoy this one. This is quite eclectic. I mentioned in that video how the imagery on the front of a lot of things going on inside this lady's brain kind of sums up the collection very much. It's quite eclectic with different references, and it deals with relationships and the development of relationships, and I thought it was very lovely. I ended up giving this 4 stars. This is a really good place to start with poetry because it is very much an introduction to a selection of what poetry can give you. It's very eclectic and there's a little bit of everything in here. So I really did enjoy this one. Then the next book I read in the month of July is The Silent Companions, which I ended up giving between 4.5 and 5 stars. I absolutely adored this book. It was a conglomeration of loads of different books in my opinion. It has a little bit of The Woman in Black, Rebecca, The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. It's really fun because it has a core similar plot line to The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton where something's not quite right, but it has this lovely Victorian, Rebecca-esque secrets of the house, secrets of the people that used to live in the house that I absolutely adored. I've realised that as I'm getting more confident with reading and as the year is progressing and I am journeying more into the booktube community, it's starting to allow me to find some niche little genres that I really enjoy, and I've decided that when I'm really in the mood, those kind of heavily driven thriller style, what's happening, who's responsible for it, strange bump in the night kind of things, crazy women, madness in women as well, in a book form, in a really well done racy plot attached to it. I absolutely adore it, and this does it so well. I'm so happy that Wild Reads and Vanessa were buddy reading it quite recently, and I just finished it when they were starting to buddy read it, and I told them that I really enjoyed it, and they both, I think, gave it 5 stars. They loved it. So I'm so happy because it is a book that I would recommend that if you like those kind of things that I've just mentioned, this book does it exceptionally well. It's fantastic. Go and read it. And then the next book I read was A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, which I buddy read with Anthony Andrews. So I'll link his channel down below. And I ended up giving that 3.5 out of 5 stars. It was very well written. I listened to it on audiobook, so I didn't actually read it in a written format, but I could tell by listening to it that it is very well written. But I don't read a lot of children's literature and I don't read a lot of fantasy. And this was quite heavily fantasy driven, but to me, I want a plot that goes somewhere, and me and Anthony both agreed that the middle half of the book, where they're travelling through these galaxies, kind of lost the thread of the meaning of why they were doing it. There was so much reiteration on them having to save their dad. So the story follows a little girl and her brother and her best friend / romantic plot device, Calvin, and Charles, I've forgotten his last name, and Megan. But basically they find out that their dad is stranded in a different galaxy and they have to go and find him, and it was constantly reiterated the importance of, you have to go and find your dad, but then it was very anticlimactic when they did find him. There wasn't really a journey of the loss of their dad. It wasn't really developed very well for me, and maybe it's because it's a children's book and they wanted to make the whole process simplistic from, right, let's go find dad, dad's found, the end. But I just didn't really connect with it, and maybe if I was younger I really would have done. So I just gave that a middle of the road 3.5. And then the next book I read this month was Visiting the Minotaur by Claire Williamson. Now I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I think between 4.5 and 5, because at the moment I haven't experienced enough poetry to adamantly give it a 5-star, because there was a lot of references to Greek mythology that just went completely over my head, and I feel like for me a 5-star in a poetry collection I have to really feel like I connect with so much of it, whereas almost half of this book references Greek mythology that just completely went over my head. But it did inspire me to start reading some Greek myths, so swings and roundabouts. This deals with a lot of grief and the thread that connects all these books. I think I liked this slightly more than in Her Shambles because this had a connecting overarching theme that I thought was really obvious that the other one didn't as such, but taking into account that all these poems had been published at different times and then they just get thrown together into a collection, you do have to give in Her Shambles the benefit of the doubt for that. But this, it kept reiterating the theme of loss, of a mother and a brother, of grief, of motherhood, of giving birth, of the relationship between a mother and a child, which I found really intense and meaty and really good. I'm very tentatively stepping into poetry. I'd love to know more about poetry and to read more poetry. I was discussing with a friend the other day about poetry and saying how once you leave university and high school it's very hard to really glean so much out of poems because you read them superficially and you're not practicing the same skill of dissecting a poem. So like I mentioned a while back now, and I'll link the video down below, Jen Campbell does a Dissect a Poem series on YouTube, and I think I'll have to go back there and have a look at being able to constructively talk about poetry in an academic sense instead of just telling you which ones I liked the sound of and which ones I liked reading aloud. So hopefully I'll get a little bit better, but this was fantastic and I would recommend to anyone who's interested in poetry to give this one a go because it's got a lot of human emotions that you can kind of resonate and connect with, even if these experiences aren't your own. And then the next book I read was The Muse by Jessie Burton. Now this was absolutely phenomenal. I think this is much better than The Miniaturist because I think this was so well thought out. So this deals with two different time periods, 1936 and 1967. In 1967, Odell is working in a art gallery. She's a black lady who's come over from the West Indies and she's trying to forge a life out here, and she by circumstance meets a man who has a painting, and this painting takes us all the way back to 1936 and what happened then. I absolutely adored all the characters in this and I was very much connected to them, which I thought was really well done. I think it's a very good sign from a writer if they make you invested in the plot but also the characters, what's happening. And they were very faulted characters, but when you have the talent to produce very faulted characters that you still have that pang of empathy and heartbreak when something goes wrong for them, I think it just says so much as a writer. What I really appreciate about this book is I see such a development in Jessie Burton's writing and storytelling ability, which I think is a credit to her. This is definitely a step up to me. This is a different class, I think, than The Miniaturist. It goes from England in 1967 to Spain in 1936. Really appreciated the references to art and politics and culture and history and what was going on in these two different time periods and how that impacts upon the characters' lives as well. Just flawless, and I really recommend to people who've read The Miniaturist and were a little bit about it, go and check this out, because I heard so many people rave about this book and I thought, well, I didn't really enjoy The Miniaturist that much, so maybe, you know, I'll skip this. And then my mum thrust this back in my hand and said, no, you really have to give it a go. I really enjoyed it, and she wasn't a fan of The Miniaturist, so I'm really glad she did, because it was very much a page turner and very interesting, so I would highly recommend. Then the last book I read, I got sent this a while ago, and this was Strangeways by Neil Samworth, a prison officer's story. Now, I got sent this by Pam Macmillan. I requested it because I was really fascinated, and always have been fascinated, in kind of crime, criminology, mental health, and I've always been fascinated in how prison systems work, aside from the kind of documentary phase that happened in the UK, where there was loads of inside prison documentaries, which I don't always think give an authentic representation. So this man, Neil Samworth, had worked in Strangeways. He'd worked at Forest Bank, and then from 2005 to 2016 worked at Strangeways before he left the service after being diagnosed with PTSD. And it's very interesting, and I lent it to my dad as well. That's why it's took me so long to get back around to reading it, because he's fascinated by anything to do with criminals and crime. He said to me afterwards that he really enjoyed the book, but you can tell he isn't a writer, and I definitely understand where he's coming from with that. He definitely isn't written in an appealing way if you like the written word. But this book does tell a story. We both agreed it tells a rather disjointed story, because he doesn't structure it exceptionally in chronological order. It's all a bit of a mess, but it's very reflective of how he feels, that the whole experience was this kind of blur of constantly being on red alert, and then at the end the kind of demise of how he felt, and the breaking point you did see in the book that it was coming. And so there was some elements of structure within this, but obviously this was him kind of randomly telling segments and things that popped into his head when he thought about his time there, and then somebody hasn't really formulated it into the most accessible way. I found this very interesting purely for its content, not particularly for its writing. That's why I'm only giving it 3 out of 5 stars, but it does tell you what you want to know about Strangeways. It tells you about how there are issues with, all the way from the beginning, with how people aren't being trained, how people are cutting corners, how there isn't systems in place to protect the mental and physical health of the people who work in the prisons, how there's a lot of sexism, how there's a lot of scandal, and how you often are in this constant state of high panic, and how that had a detrimental effect on his relationship with his wife and his daughter, and how he's one of many who's had to leave the profession because it's really affected him. And the person he was when he started, he kept reiterating he's had a tough life, he's a hard Yorkshireman who's seen it all, and then to see his vulnerability at the end of the book was very interesting. So I would recommend it if you really want to know more about Strangeways, which I did because it's very near, so it's not that far away from me, and it's very infamous for all the wrong reasons, so I wanted to know a little bit more about that. But it wasn't particularly well written, so I don't know whether, if you want to know more about Strangeways, there are better books out there. But to hear it from his point of view was a unique take on that, and he gives us a lot of insight that we wouldn't necessarily know about being a prison officer. So it has its usefulness, but overall it wasn't the most exciting read of the month for me. So that is all the books I read in July. I'll also link them down below on the book depository, so if you feel like I didn't really give an adequate description of those books, you can go and check them out. I also have a book depository affiliate link, which I'll link down below, and then that way you could go and maybe, if you want to pick one of these books up, if you use the link, that might help me just a tiny bit, and I would really appreciate that. But that's everything. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you want to be alerted for when any of my future videos come out. And I'll see you guys very soon. Bye now.